right. Well, thank you all for coming. As Brian said, my name is Andrew. I joined Oasis Digital as a developer earlier this year, and since then I've been working on Angular apps and an API in Loopback. So I've been learning a lot about this framework, and I'm excited to share with you guys what I've learned and how you might be able to use Loopback in your projects. So first of all, what is Loopback? Loopback is a Node framework built on top of Express. Express is the most popular web framework in Node. The benefit of Loopback here is that you can work at a higher level of abstraction. In Express, you have to handle a lot of things yourself. You have to parse request bodies and return status codes when you're supposed to and things like that. All of that is taken care of in the box with Loopback. So that enables you to really build out your API more, especially for larger projects. Another benefit of Loopback is that you have one language. So if you have an Angular app, you're probably using TypeScript. Or in an edge case, you might be using JavaScript. If you're using Loopback or Express in that case, you have one code base. This is a big benefit, especially as you grow your team. Then you don't have to look for people who have expertise in both. As I mentioned, there's lots of functionality in the box, and I'll get to that more about that in a moment. And a little bit of history. It was released by StrongLoop, which was the startup company that made Loopback back in 2013. And then it was acquired by IBM in 2015. So there are a lot of resources behind Loopback, and new versions are always coming out. So there's a new version of Loopback, which is 4.0, that's coming out soon. Currently it's on 3.x. And also, finally, the co-founders are main and core contributors to Node. So they're very highly integrated into the Node community, and so Loopback is this very fundamental project that has a lot of support. One more thing I wanted to mention on this slide. It looks like IBM is stepping on Express and Node. That's not really the case. They are contributors to the Express project, and you can see that on the Express website as well. So a few companies that are using Loopback. These are some big ones that you probably have heard of: GoDaddy, Symantec, and U.S. Department of Energy. And there's a whole bunch more. Mostly they look like they were startups and things like that. So this is a really high-level overview, and you can't read this code, but that's okay. This is really just a comparison of Express and Loopback. So first of all, it's not really Express versus Loopback, because you can do anything in Loopback that you can do in Express because it's built on top of Express. But really, this is sort of to motivate why you'd want to move from something like Express to Loopback. So on the left, there's code that's written by a developer on GitHub to implement some CRUD operations to wrap a MongoDB instance. So they have git, post, put, and delete endpoints. And this was all code that the developer had to write. So they're specifying the port number, they're parsing different parts of the request and things like that. And they're returning 500 HTTP code when they're supposed to do that. So all that the developer had to think about and write, and then possibly unit test, especially as the project grows. On the right, though, we have a Loopback instance that does the same thing. The huge difference is that none of this code was written. This is all JSON that's output by this CLI that Loopback has. And so really a real comparison would have the right side being blank, because the developer didn't write any code at all. So in this case, there are really three files that really are defining this MongoDB connection. And you can also do this programmatically in JavaScript code via the API. So you don't have to use a CLI. There's always different ways to do things in Loopback. Another thing that comes in the box is API Explorer. This is a great way to try out your API and also to collaborate with other people on your API server. So you can just point them to this URL, and they can see what endpoints you have, and they can also interact with those endpoints. This is included by default. There's no comparison to that in Express that comes in the box, at least. Another thing to point out here is that with this endpoint, or with this model, and I'll get to what models are in a second as well, called people, all of these CRUD operations were included without having to write any code as well. So in that previous example, you get all those CRUD operations like this without any additional configuration. This is one of the big benefits of Loopback, which they even put on their website in bold. So just to sort of drive that point home. And then I'd like to touch a little bit on the architecture of Loopback. So in Loopback terminology, there's sort of the concept of a model and a concept of a connector. And a model is similar to what you'd have in, I think of it like sort of what you'd have in data science or something like that, where you have in the computer your representation of what you're trying to store in your database or whatever your backing storage is. So if you have a model of a person, you'd have different properties about that person in the model, but it has nothing to do with how it's with the nuts and bolts of how it's put into your database. And then the connector is really the lowest level of abstraction here, where that's actually connecting your models to your database. So you can create these models using the CLI, using this command lb model. You can also edit the JSON, and you can also write JavaScript code and use the API programmatically. And finally, models have relationships, so they can inherit other models. The main base model that you would inherit in Loopback is called persisted model, and that's basically anything that's persisting data to a backing store. There's also these relationships. So one type is belongs to. So if you have something like you're doing some kind of healthcare application, a physician belongs to a hospital, maybe a patient belongs to a physician. And there's the concept of has many. So a hospital has many physicians. And once you set up these relationships, it takes care of creating endpoints to then get the data out that represents these relationships without having to, again, write any code. And so I also forgot to mention earlier, but there's going to be a live coding part about halfway through, so then I'll show a lot of this stuff in action. So attaching models to data sources. So there's that previous diagram where we have this data source between a model and a connector. What is a data source? Well, it takes a little bit of thinking when you look at the docs at first, because it looks like they're using connectors like data sources. But it turns out it's just a configured instance of a connector. So you can have many different instances of a MongoDB database, and each one has its own configuration. So each one of those instances would be considered a data source. Again, there's 3 ways to do this, just like there is in most things in Loopback. You can configure in the JSON, you can use the CLI, or you can do it with the API. This is a little bit more about those model relationships. I'll just touch on this real briefly. You can use the CLI LB relation to set these up, but this is sort of an example of a relationship that you can build. So you have a category which has many products, and a product belongs to a category, and that's all linked up using this foreign key, which is the category ID. That would be the ID of the category that you're linking to. And there's also ways in Loopback to implement access control. In Loopback, this is really putting restrictions on models. So you define what different users can do on that model in terms of the endpoints. And endpoints are split into read versus write operations. So you can say this group of users can only read but not write, and things like that. So this is the general process of access control. It's really not specific to Loopback, but that's how it's done in Loopback as well. You can also add custom endpoints. And Loopback terminology, this is called a remote method. You can do this with the CLI using LB remote method, or again, you can do it in JSON or JavaScript. All right, so now I'm going to switch to live coding. In this part, I'm going to stand up actually an instance of Loopback and show how to integrate it with the Tour of Heroes, which we've seen for the last 2 sessions. That'll be just a quick way to show how you can use it with your Angular app. And then if we have time, I'll get to a couple other things that Loopback can do. All right. All right, so the first thing I'm going to do is open up a new console. And this is just the git bash console inside of conemu. I'm going to make a new directory for my Loopback instance. Okay, let me remove the old one first. And since it's a node project, it's got thousands of files. All right. So to install the CLI on your machine, you'll need to use the command npm install global loopback CLI. But I've already installed this CLI, so I don't have to do that here. I just call lb, which is the CLI command, without any parameters or arguments. I accept the default name. I'm going to use the current version, and I'm going to build an API server. There's different types of applications you can build with the CLI to have it scaffold out. I'm going to start with API server, and it creates the files and it does an npm install for you. So we can go ahead and look at what files it created. Alright, so this is the folder including all of the files that the CLI created. There's a client folder, which is Loopback's intended destination for your application to live, the client side, that is. Then there's a server directory, which contains the entire Loopback instance. There's also going to be another directory called common, where your models will get put, and the idea is that you can use that common directory to sync up your models with your application, so you have one source of code instead of having to synchronize between your client and your server. Alright, inside the server directory, there's a bunch of JSON configuration files, and there's this boot directory and server.js. So server.js is responsible for spinning up the instance, and it does things like logging out that it's listening with a certain URL and port number, and it also has this boot function, which actually starts up Loopback, and that causes Loopback to look for these config files in this directory. Okay. These different config files configure different parts of Loopback. So this one configures components. The main component that comes by default is, of course, the Explorer that I mentioned earlier. In config.json, you configure really the core of your Loopback API. So you tell it where your API should live, what its host and port is, and then a few other parameters as well. Data sources. This is where you specify and configure your data sources. So by default, there's a memory data source, which just puts everything in memory, and that way you can start using your Loopback instance without having to connect it up to a database. In middleware, you can specify middleware, just like you would with Express. The only difference is that Loopback adds an ability to have what's called phases to clearly define when your different middleware is added. Because in Express, really, it's just the order in which you call the use statements. So a lot of this stuff is boilerplate, not very interesting, but we do have our API, REST API defined here in the routes. And finally, we have a model config file. And this is defining some models that come in the box. So since I chose an API server, it has a user defined, and that's persisted to the memory just along with everything else. Inside this boot directory, we have an authentication that's enabled, and we have this endpoint that simply prints out the status of the server at the root level. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and spin this up now that it's finished npm installing. So to do that, I'm going to do node dot, and that will start node in the current directory. And then I'll show the Explorer now. So this is what we have. We have our user model, and these are all the endpoints that are already built in the box. Okay. When you do something like a get, it gives you an example that you can use, and then there's various parameters you can specify. We can't use this yet because this is not supposed to be there, because we are not authenticated. We'll get to that in a minute, or if we have time. Okay, now I'm going to grab the tour of heroes, and which, if you've been around, you know what that is. if you haven't been to the last couple or you haven't used the Angular tutorial, it's basically the default tutorial for learning Angular. So I'm going to download the completed Tour of Heroes, extract that. I'm going to move that to my Documents folder, so it's right next to the Loopback instance. Now I'm going to actually fire this up and show what it looks like. So I'm doing an npm install. And while that's going, this is going to be at 4200 since that's the default for the Angular CLI. Alright, now npm start. Alright, so this is the Tour of Heroes. We have our 4 top heroes, and we can also do things like look at the list of all the heroes, and we can also add new heroes. We can also remove them as well. So there's a few other features here, but these are the ones we're going to touch on. Okay, so in order to sync this up, we want to look at what the hero is representing. Well, let's just quickly look at that code. Alright, so the app lives under this folder, and so the main class that we have for hero is this one. So it simply has an ID and a name. So we want to build a model in Loopback that reflects this. So to do that, I'm going to open up the Loopback tab. I'm going to close it with Control-C and do lb model. This is going to create a new model. I'm going to call it hero, and I'm going to persist it to memory, and I'm going to have it inherit persisted model since we want it to be persisted. I'm going to expose this by default, and I'm going to call it heroes. Loopback will generally pluralize the name of your model by adding an S, so we don't really want it to be hero with just S. And I'm going to have it save this model to the common directory so that it can be used by both the client and the server, although we won't really do that here. Okay, now it's going to ask me to enter properties. So the first property that I want to add is name, and it's a string, which is required. I'm not going to give it a default value. And there's another property which is ID, but Loopback will auto-inject that, so I don't need to add it. Alright. The other thing I want to do is I want to have it so that when I restart my Loopback server, it actually uses the data that was stored in it before. So I can do that in Loopback here by editing this data sources file. I can add a property called file, and I'm going to call it db.json. So it will save the memory to a JSON file. Alright, now I'm going to restart this, the Loopback server. Refresh the Explorer, and we can see it's added our hero model, and it included all of those operations that we didn't have to implement. So now we can get our list of heroes, which should be empty, and we can also post our own new heroes. It accepts stringified JSON, so we can put in a name. And the ID again will be injected. So we have added a superhero. So if I do a get, I can see that that was added. It also provides curl, a curl operation you can copy and paste into your terminal if you want to do that. It shows where the request URL lives, and other things like the response headers are also provided. Okay, so to actually serve up our application, we want to enable static files to be served. And so we need a little bit of middleware to do that. So I'm going to look at the Loopback doc, and there's a little bit of middleware we can add. That's this bit right here. So I'm going to go back to the Loopback code, add this to middleware.json in the files part. And what this says, according to the doc, is that it indicates the path is relative to that file. So basically what that's doing is it's serving up the client folder at the root level of our API. Alright, and so the other thing I need to do is I need to turn off this, root level status message. So currently, if I go to localhost 3000, I get a message about when it was started and how long it's been up. So I'm going to just remove this route. Alright. Now I'm going to restart the server.
It's not saved to change.
What's that?
It's not
Oh.
saved to change.
Thanks. Alright, npm start again. Alright. So now if we try to do localhost 3000, we're going to get an error because there's no files there. So let's go ahead and put a file in there. This is in the client directory. And this is going to then serve that up. Alright. So now we want to actually set up the two peers to use our API. So there's just a couple changes we have to make in that code base. The hero service is what actually loads the data from the API. So we can see it lives at app/heroes in the Tour of Heroes project. So I'm going to change the API to live under app instead of API. I'm going to go back to the Loopback code. I'm going to change config.json, have this be app. A couple other things too. The Tour of Heroes uses an in-memory data service, which stores everything under the .data property. We don't have that in our API since we have an actual API, so I'm going to remove that. Those are really the only two changes we need to make. And also we need to remove this in-memory data service. So I'm going to go ahead and delete that file, and then I'm going to go ahead and remove it from the module so that it's not being added at all. Okay. Alright. So I'm going to do a build. I'm not going to worry about prod for now, so it'll be a dev build. This is going to generate those static files that we can serve. So that gets generated under the dist folder, and we can just copy those over. So now if we refresh, we have the Tour of Heroes. I'm also going to restart that server to change the API route. Okay. So now the Tour of Heroes has our Superman that we created before. We can also add new heroes this way. And they're using the API. So if we go over to the Explorer, we can do the get operation again. Oops, need to refresh. We can see that that was added to our API. All right. So if you wanted to sort of develop your API without having to copy over dist files every time you would proxy the API to live on the same port inside of the Angular CLI settings. I'm going to show a couple other features that aren't part of the tour of heroes. I'm going to make a relation, as I talked about before, and show how that can be fairly powerful. So I'm going to go ahead and make a new model called Studio, and that's going to be the studio that owns the rights to the hero. And then we'll create a relation. All right. So to do that, I'm going to do LB model again. I'm going to call it Studio. I'm going to use the database memory, persisted model. I'll expose it. I think studios will be fine. Put it in the common folder. And I'm going to add a property called name again. That'll be required. No default value. Okay. So now I should have that new studio model in there. I'm going to create a relation. So first I have to create a property on the first model, the hero model. So I select hero, enter the property name. Property name will be studio ID, and that's going to be the foreign key that we sync up the two. This will be a number, not required, empty default value.
So, quick question, just to be clear, we're not trying to say that, oh, we're kind of trying to create this relational database in memory. Rather, we're actually linking across multiple different, possibly multiple different, like distributed backing data stores. Maybe the studio is in a SQL server over here, and the heroes might be coming from sort of like big data service behind an API over here, and we're linking them in our API server, right?
That's a very good point. So the two models can live on entirely different backing data stores because they each have their own data source specified. So now I'm going to call LB relation, and that'll set up the relationship. I'm going to first select studio, and I'm going to say that it has many. So a studio has many heroes. I'm going to enter the property name, heroes. I'm going to enter a foreign key, which is studio ID. And I will not require a through model. I'll accept these defaults. And then I'll make one more relation to go the other way. So here I'm going to select hero, and it belongs to a studio. And the foreign key is against studio ID. Not nested. Yep. All right, now I can restart the server. You can see our new studio model. So if we go to hero, or first of all, let's go to the studio and add some studios. So we can post a couple studios. Does everyone know which studio the Batman and DC? Okay. Okay. Are they both DC? Okay. We'll probably want to do another one then. Okay. Now if I go back to the hero model, I can specify, well, sorry, I'm jumping around a lot. Let's go back and look at what those IDs were. So the IDs were auto-injected. So we have DC is 1 and Marvel is 2. Alright. Now we can replace existing models. And that will be 1. Alright. Looks like it may not have replaced it, but that's okay. What are some other ones we can add? We can add Iron Man. That should be 2 for Marvel. Alright. So these are added now. We should have a hero in 1 and a hero in the other. So we can use these endpoints that are auto-generated to get the heroes that exist for each studio. So here we can say Studio 1 should get all the heroes, and that brings back Batman for DC, and for Marvel we've got Iron Man. So there's a whole bunch of other operations that you can do out of the box. So it's quite powerful in that way. Alright. One last thing I can show is access control. So there's built-in ways to do access control, as I talked about earlier. These rely on tokens being returned when you log in. Since I chose an API server, the user model was already built in, so I can go ahead and use it to create a user first and then log in. So I'm going to post a new user. I'm just going to put an email in. I'm going to put a password. Shouldn't be blank. Oh, it should be a string, right? Okay, so now I have a new user. If I log in with this user, down here,
I want to interrupt again. Did you guys catch how gracefully it handled the fact that the password was the wrong kind of data? You didn't have to write any code to get it to do that. It just did it. It didn't die. It didn't crash. It didn't have to go and tell it the right thing. It just did it.
So here I just logged in by giving it a name and password, and it returns this ID, which is actually the access token. So if I copy this and I put this up here, now I'm logged in, and so if I set access controls on other endpoints, then I would be able to use them up to my level of authentication, up to my level of access. So let me go ahead and turn on access control and demonstrate that. I'm going to stop the server, and I'm going to call lbacl. It stands for access control list. I'm going to choose all existing models and all methods and properties. And I'm going to say write. So what I'm going to try to do is any unauthenticated user will not be able to write, but they will be able to read. I'm going to explicitly deny access. Alright. So now if I start up again, Okay. If I try to get, that should work. Okay. If I try to post, I guess it probably remembers that I logged in. Let me clear this. I'm not authorized. So that was all without really writing any code at all. Right. So that concludes my presentation. Thank you. I have a few resources in case you want to learn more. I have put this up on GitHub, although it's pretty small, so I'm mostly using the CLI. Are there any questions? Yep.
How would you hook it in, like you want to add some validation,
Yeah, that's a good question. The question was about hooking in validation and custom business logic. So Loopback has JavaScript hooks all over the place, so you can use those to do validation, and I've seen that done. I think that is the typical way you do it. I don't have an example to share, but it's one of the topics. I think, let's see, if you look at this link, they do custom validation in this tutorial series.
What about when you added a model or added like a whole bunch of components, is it easy to just go in, you just go to a file and remove components and do all those operations?
Yeah, so you can do several different things. You could choose to inherit model and then you don't have any endpoints included by default. You can also disable them. There's a API call that disables individual endpoints, and we've done both of those.
Okay.
Sure.
So this is pretty simple because it was like creating this in-memory database at every model outputs, but like you actually are trying to map this back to the MySQL database. You wouldn't need a lot of configuration to map these tables.
So the question is about hooking up MySQL or another type of database. Basically, most of those come as npm packages, the connector that you need. So you do an npm install of the right loopback connector package, and then you would call lb data source to configure it, and then it would be available to any model that you build. I don't have an example of that either, but you can do that all in the CLI without writing code.
It seemed really simple to do it with the in-memory, I just
But like to change it after the fact, like isn't it a one-line config change, like in the model JSON?
Yeah, so in the code, that would be under the server in model config, and you would change this data source to be the data source that you just created. So when you use the lb data source command, that would create a new entry in this file with the corresponding name.
How does it handle the new things? So if I install Loopback today, set up a new project, and 6 months from now, you release a new update, something regional thing. Will that handle the migration of all my metadata to the new formats?
So I believe we haven't encountered this yet, but really, like the stuff that you develop and the loopback itself, like the instance, are kind of separated. So there's really, it's like booting up, and so then it goes in and loads your config files. So you can keep all your config files and then upgrade your loopback version separately.
So there's a guarantee that all those configuration files will not change, say, structure or
break.
compatible with
Yeah.
configuration files that were written years ago.
Yeah, so you're asking about breaking changes. The new version that's coming out, 4.0, they say that is not going to introduce breaking changes, so that version 3 and version 2 projects will continue working in it. So it looks like they're committed to compatibility at this point, but I wouldn't know for sure because I'm not on the team. I know that 2 and 3 did not, 3 did not break 2, and sounds like 4 won't break either. So
I have seen, I ran into something one time where there were API changes. So if you were doing something that was a little more custom, you had JavaScript code to handle that custom logic calling out to Loopback API. There were some changes to that. They had this really super simple migration guide saying, that endpoint was deprecated, use this when it said, and walked you right through it. But in terms of the actual internal representation of these models, I don't know what they use internally to represent them. So I don't know what would even break there. So those connectors that you're talking about, so you said you use npm install them. Are those Loopback produces these connectors and you just go grab the one you want? Are they community provided? How does that work?
it's a little bit of both. So Loopback's developed some connectors of their own. Well, not Loopback, but Strong Loop. And then there's community connectors as well. I'm not 100% on this, but I think the MongoDB one might be community. I'm not sure. But most of the connectors are npm packages, so yeah.
So I'm still having a hard time wrapping my head around. So I have a MongoDB connector. So in my MongoDB store, I've got all these entities and they've got these various properties on them. How do I get the Loopback API to just kind of understand those properties without having to write some logic to map it to say when I want to go fetch this, you got to go look on this property for it. Are there any tutorials that walk you through that part of it where you have to map it together, or is it?
Yeah, so MongoDB is maybe not the best example because it's NoSQL, so you can sort of put whatever you want into it. But there are, in Loopback, there's, I forget the name, but a way to connect to a SQL database and then automatically pull from that what the form of your data looks like, and then have the model reflect that.
It's when you're creating the model connected to the data source, it helps you bridge that?
Yeah, I don't know at what point that happens. That's a good question. I think most of the examples I've seen don't use this feature. They sort of set up their model to reflect the database. But most tutorials cover connecting to data sources, which is why I didn't cover that here. So either of the ones on this page, these helpful tutorials will cover some of that. All right, any more questions? All right, well, thank you, everyone.